It was a Friday afternoon, warm and still, with the first whispers of summer in the air. I had just dropped off my Subaru for servicing and decided to have the technician drop me off at home instead of returning to the office. I figured I'd use the rare free time to chip away at the pile of yard work waiting for me. Our house was a modest 2-story on the edge of a sprawling lot, bordered by a patch of woods that I could get lost in. It was peaceful, at least until my brother's unmistakable red Mustang pulled into the driveway. Eric never visited unless he wanted to borrow something, usually something he wouldn't return or, if he did, it would come back half-functional. From where I stood near the tree line, rake in hand, I heard voices drifting through the open garage. One of them stopped me in my tracks. "Hey, Dad," Sam called out cheerfully, the kind of tone that always melted my stress away. The words that followed, however, froze me to my core. "Dad, what brings you to the land of the chickens?" It was a small word, yet it felt like a sledgehammer to the chest. I crept closer, my footsteps muffled by the soft dirt, until I could make out their conversation. Eric let out a deep, arrogant chuckle that I'd grown up hating. "I'm just dropping off Uncle Joe's circular saw. Accidentally cut the cord, needs fixing, so I can finish my project." "Clueless Joe," Sam chimed in. I didn't burst in. I didn't shout. I didn't demand answers. Instead, I did what any self-respecting CFO with a Type A personality and a knack for organization would do. I turned on my phone and hit record. Eric's voice boomed again. "He's rarely home before 5, and let's be honest, he's not the most exciting guy to be around, right, Sam?" Sam chuckled nervously. "Yeah, I guess." I pressed my back against the garage wall, breathing shallow, the recorder in my hand capturing every word, each one carving deep fissures into the foundation of my life. Eric continued, his tone dropping to a mock whisper. "Your mom's got a plan. She's supposed to spend Thursday afternoon with me so we can figure out when you're staying at my place this summer. You'll love it there, way more fun than here." Sam asked innocently, "Why doesn't Mom just divorce Clueless Joe and move in with you?" There was a beat of silence before Eric answered, smug as always. "Because, buddy, she loves having a husband she can parade around. Joe's stable provides a nice life and lets her live the way she wants. And hey, you're here because of me, right?" The casual betrayal rolled off his tongue as if he were reading a weather report. My chest tightened as I slid down the garage wall, landing in the hosta garden below, somewhere between the earthy smell of crushed plants and the distant sound of Sam laughing. My world came to a screeching halt. What the fuck? My son, my wife, my brother. This wasn't a betrayal. This was annihilation. After that earth-shattering conversation, I stumbled back to the backyard and sat on the rope swing Sam used to love. My head buzzed with questions that wouldn't stop, like an old engine that refused to die. I needed clarity. I needed proof. My first thought was Sam's DNA test, a few years back when we'd all done one of those 23andMe kits. Carol had said it would be fun for the family to explore our ancestry, though now the memory of her insistence felt suspicious. If Sam was Eric's, the results should have said something. But what if she tampered with the test, switched out my sample for Eric's? The thought made my stomach churn. I didn't even know where to start unraveling this web. A good accountant doesn't dive into an audit blind. I needed to piece together the numbers before I started balancing the books of betrayal. That night at dinner, I watched Carol like a hawk. She was radiant as always, wearing the little navy dress I'd bought her for our anniversary. Her smile was warm, her laugh infectious, and she filled my plate with extra roasted potatoes, like she always did when she wanted me to feel special. If she was guilty, she didn't show it. Sam sat across the table, glued to his phone, barely looking up except to mutter half-hearted answers to my questions. My son? Or was he? When Sam excused himself to meet up with friends, Carol and I were left alone in the kitchen. She smiled as she rinsed the dishes, then handed me a towel. "Teamwork makes the dream work," she said, brushing against me playfully. As I turned to dry the plate, I caught her reflection in the window. For a moment, her smile faltered. It wasn't exhaustion, it was something deeper, darker. I had to know. The next morning, while Carol went to her yoga class and Sam slept in, I headed to my office. My home office was as meticulous as I was, with file cabinets labeled, shelves alphabetized. Somewhere in that room was the 23andMe kit. But after tearing through 3 drawers, I realized it wasn't where I'd left it. Panic began to set in. Had she taken it? Destroyed it? Then, in the bottom of a box marked Old Receipts, I found it. The results were sealed in their original envelope. I tore it open, my hands trembling. Sam's DNA was a 50% match to mine. Relief surged through me for a fleeting second. But then it hit me. 50% meant he was related to me. But Eric and I shared the same father. If Eric was Sam's biological father, the results would look the same. I sat back in my chair, cold sweat running down my spine. I couldn't prove anything without another test, one that Eric couldn't meddle with. The opportunity presented itself sooner than I expected. The following day, the 3 of us, Carol, Sam, and I, drove to my parents' house for my father's 70th birthday. My father, Edward, was the patriarch of the family business, Tyndall Manufacturing. He and my mother, Sally, had built a respectable life together, and their home was the unofficial Tyndall headquarters. Eric, of course, was already there, laughing with Sam in the backyard when we arrived. My blood boiled, watching them together, their shared body language, the same smirking arrogance. Carol didn't seem thrilled to see Eric either. She gave him a perfunctory hug, barely more than a pat on the back, and avoided his gaze during dinner. If I didn't know better, I'd think they were strangers. But now I did know better. During a lull in the conversation, I cast my fishing line. "Eric," I said, cutting into my steak, "can you cover for me at the office on Thursday? I've got a meeting with the CPA." His fork froze halfway to his mouth. No can do. Big project. I'll be out." Carol shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her face pale. She blew a few bubbles into her iced tea, a nervous tic I'd noticed years ago. She avoided my eyes, but I caught the smallest glance toward Eric. Bingo. I wasn't sure where the rabbit hole would lead, but I was ready to dive in. The dinner at my parents' house went downhill fast. My subtle fishing had caught more than I expected. Carol's pale face, Eric's defensive tone, and the uneasy glances around the table, it all screamed guilt. My father broke the tension with his usual authoritative bluster. "I'm glad you boys are here for my birthday," Edward began, raising his glass. "This family has built something strong, and I trust you two to carry it forward. That's why I've decided to make a change. I'm stepping down as president of Tyndall Manufacturing. Eric will be the new president." My gut dropped. I hadn't seen this coming. Edward continued, smiling as if he just handed out free gold bars. "Joe, you'll stay on as CFO and COO, of course. Eric's salary will reflect his new position. Joe's will be 75% of his." The words hit like a slap. The table was silent, except for the sound of my mother fiddling with her napkin. Carol, who usually smiled warmly at Edward's grand announcement, was staring at her plate. Eric, smug as ever, broke the quiet. "You'll still be great at what you do, Joe. Numbers and small details. That's your wheelhouse. But leading the company, that takes an alpha." I forced a smile so tight it could have cracked glass. "Congratulations, Eric." Fuck. Inside, I was crumbling. The next day, I took stock of my life, piece by piece, like any seasoned accountant would. The betrayal wasn't confined to Carol and Eric. It stretched to my parents, the business I devoted my life to, and even Sam. My parents' favoritism had always been clear, but now it felt personal. Edward's choice to elevate Eric wasn't about merit. It was about blood. Eric was the Tyndall son, the golden boy, while I had been the diligent workhorse, dutiful but overlooked. And Sam, my son, or was he? I hated myself for doubting him, the boy I'd raised, taught to throw a baseball and helped with school projects. But the thought of Eric tainting even that bond was unbearable. I needed more answers. Carol's phone was my next target. She wasn't careless, but she wasn't a security expert either. That evening, while she showered, I slipped her phone from the nightstand. The password was her usual one, our anniversary. It's a little ironic, from the outside. One would think we were a happy couple. Scrolling through her messages, I didn't find anything incriminating at first. Just the usual threads with friends, work chats, and online shopping confirmations. But then, buried near the bottom, was a contact listed as E.T., Eric Tyndall. My hands shook as I opened the thread. Most of it was mundane coordination about family events or sharing updates about Sam, but one message from a month ago made my blood run cold. Thursday works for me. Same time. E.T. Perfect. Be ready for me this time. When I returned her phone, my mind raced. There was no doubt now. Eric wasn't just Sam's biological father. He was actively involved with Carol. I couldn't stay in the dark any longer. That night, I waited for Carol to fall asleep. Then I slipped out of bed and grabbed her car keys. The GPS system in her Lexus logged every destination she'd visited. Scrolling through the history, I found it. Thursday afternoons, Eric's address, every single week. I put the keys down and stared at her sleeping form. The woman I'd built my life around, trusted implicitly, had been sneaking off to my brother's house for years. It wasn't just betrayal. It was premeditated. The next day, I made my decision. I wasn't just going to confront them. I was going to destroy them. But destroying them was not enough, though I wanted it to hurt, and I wanted it to last. I spent the next week planning everything down to the smallest detail, leveraging every bit of my precision and expertise. They'd humiliated me for years. Now it was my turn. The first step was quiet preparation. I gathered everything I needed without raising suspicion. Over the next few days, I copied files from Tyndall Manufacturing Systems. Financial statements, proprietary designs, even Eric's client communications. I had full access as CFO, so no one questioned it. I also retrieved every document proving my patents were legally separate from the company's operations. That was leverage for later. Next came the personal side. I booked a consultation with a divorce lawyer, laying out the situation in clinical detail. Infidelity? Check. Potential fraud regarding Sam's parentage? Check. They're in for a world of hurt, my lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Barbara Cole, said grimly, scribbling notes. Let's make this airtight. Once I had my legal ducks in a row, I turned my focus to the family business. Sunday morning, I drove to Tyndall Manufacturing. The building was empty, just as I expected. Using my keys, I disarmed the security system and made my way to the server room. I didn't steal anything outright. That would have been illegal. Instead, I transferred funds between accounts and locked down access to our financial systems. I rerouted all vendor payments to require my approval, then changed the passwords for the accounts. The money was still there, technically, but without my access, Eric and Edward wouldn't be able to touch it for weeks. I wasn't done yet. The manufacturing floor relied on state-of-the-art CNC machines, all linked to our network. I updated the software permissions, requiring administrative clearance for operation. Since I was the only administrator left in the system, those machines were essentially useless. By the time I left, the company was financially crippled and operationally paralyzed. The next stage of my plan involved Eric's personal life. I knew Eric wasn't exactly faithful to anyone. His charm, such as it was, made him a magnet for attention. Over the years, he'd bragged about his conquests, often involving women he had no business pursuing, employees' wives, business associates, you name it. And Eric, being Eric, had kept trophies. I found them on his work computer, folders of videos, photos, and chat logs. Carol was in a few of them, but the bulk featured other women, some clearly recorded without their knowledge. One particular video caught my attention. It showed Eric in a seedy hotel room with the wife of a former employee, a man named John Brown. John and I had been close once, and I knew he'd always suspected his wife's infidelity during a rough patch in their marriage. This was my ace in the hole. I copied the files onto a USB drive, then left Eric's computer untouched. It wouldn't take much to set the dominoes falling. The final piece of my revenge came during the family's weekly dinner at my parents' house. I arrived early, carrying my usual calm demeanor. No one suspected a thing. Carol was already there, chatting with my mother in the kitchen. Eric, as usual, was late, slapping me on the back like we were best buddies. The conversation flowed easily, though I noticed Carol avoiding my gaze. Halfway through dinner, I dropped the bomb. So, I said casually, setting my fork down. Eric, you've been busy lately. Between your big project and Carol's visits, how do you find time to run the company? The silence was deafening. My father's face turned beet red. My mother looked like she might faint. Eric stammered something unintelligible, but it was Carol's reaction that sealed the deal. She dropped her glass, the wine spilling across the table like blood. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. I leaned back, savoring the moment. "Oh, nothing. Just the usual Thursday afternoon rendezvous. GPS data doesn't lie, sweetheart." The fallout was immediate and spectacular. Eric lunged at me, but I was ready. I sidestepped him, landing a solid punch to his jaw that sent him sprawling. My father tried to intervene, but I turned on him with years of pent-up rage. "You did this!" I shouted. "You knew what he was, and you still handed him everything. The company, the family legacy, and now my wife." Eric, clutching his jaw, snarled, "You're just jealous, Joe. You've always been jealous." "Jealous?" I laughed bitterly. "Of what? Your incompetence? Your sleaziness? Or the fact that you're screwing my wife behind my back?" My mother gasped, my father looked away, and Carol crumpled into her chair, sobbing. I walked out that night, leaving the family in ruins, but I wasn't done. Walking out of that house was like closing the door on an old, rotting life. I didn't feel sadness. I felt exhilaration. Finally, the truth was out. The rest was just a matter of execution. The first shockwave came the following Monday morning when Edward discovered the company's financial state. He called me in a panic, barking about locked accounts and frozen systems. "You have to fix this, Joe," he shouted, his tone dripping with desperation. "Fix it," I replied, my voice calm. "I see why Eric's the president. Let him handle it." "Don't play games with me, boy," Edward snapped. "You know damn well Eric can't handle this, and yet you gave him the job." I let the silence linger, savoring every second. "Good luck, Dad," I said, hanging up before he could respond. The second shockwave hit Eric. The USB drive I'd prepared found its way into John Brown's hands. John had always been a straight-laced guy, loyal to a fault. But when he saw the video of Eric with his wife, something in him snapped. John didn't come to me for advice. He didn't need to. One evening, Eric left a bar and walked to his car, only to find John waiting in the shadows. Eric ended up in the hospital with a broken nose, 2 cracked ribs, and a mangled face. When asked what happened, Eric claimed it was a mugging. I didn't correct him. Carol, meanwhile, faced her own reckoning. The video of her and Eric had gone viral among students at her school. Someone, possibly one of John's sons, had anonymously emailed it to a group of senior boys with a subject line that read, "Principal screws more than just the rules." By the time Carol arrived at work the next day, the halls were alive with the sounds of the video. Students, teachers, even the janitor, everyone seemed to know. Her office became her prison. The school board acted swiftly. Carol was removed as principal and reassigned to a windowless basement office, tasked with reviewing state education guidelines. Her dignity was shattered. As for Edward and Sally, their downfall came with poetic irony. Tyndall Manufacturing couldn't recover from the chaos I'd created. The mortgage Edward took out to keep the company afloat drained their finances, and when the company finally sold to a competitor, it wasn't enough to cover their debts. The 160-acre family farm, our supposed legacy, was auctioned off piece by piece to developers. Edward and Sally moved into a small apartment, their pride as hollow as their savings. When they passed a few years later, the Tyndall name existed only on tombstones. Sam. He was furious at first. Furious that I'd cut off his college fund, furious that I'd left, and furious that his golden image of Eric had shattered. We stopped speaking, and honestly, I didn't care. Sam wasn't my son. For me, the future began with a fresh start. I moved out of town, taking a job with a competitor that appreciated my skills. One of my first calls as their new CFO was to poach Tyndall Manufacturing's best clients. Business thrived, and so did I. It wasn't long before I found someone new, Mickey Donan, a smart, beautiful woman who turned out to be the daughter of my new company's CEO. At first, I thought it might complicate things, but Mickey insisted she wanted me for me, not my title. Our relationship grew slowly, built on trust, not lies. Eventually, I proposed, and to my surprise, she said yes. Her parents were thrilled, and for the first time in years, I felt like part of a family again. But this time, for real. The final act of my revenge came during a surprise visit to my old stomping grounds. Tyndall Manufacturing, now absorbed into my new company, hosted an all-employee meeting to announce a change in leadership. When I stepped onto the stage, the room erupted in cheers. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, "I'm honored to be your new president. Let's make this company stronger than it's ever been." Eric and Edward's failures were now my successes. The Tyndall name was dead, but my new one, Joseph Donan, was thriving. Sometimes, destruction is the only path to rebirth.